Gracias, Stefano, por.
Thank you, Stefano, for your excellent presentation and the good work you're doing from the observatory. Now, to conclude, Yasmin and Fabio will present their study, and with this, we would conclude this first part.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Philcams for inviting us and for involving us into this project. We don't do it, I'm not doing it because it is something that is due, but I'm doing it wholeheartedly because it's really a concrete and actual action that finally puts into practice and involves the participation of all the players in this trade. ECPAT, well, you know it already. It's a network that's been present in all countries. It's acting under the mandate of the UN, and it has an observatory position. Among all the activities that are being carried out in Italy for 6 years, we also have a study center that is perfectly in line with the Safe Host project, because it is that interface that permits to analyze the phenomenon and then to actually allows to actually create ad hoc actions of awareness and training, specifically in this trade that we are discussing today, so the tourism industry, in order to instruct and educate all the players in this trade to effectively fight this phenomenon. I want to start by describing this phenomenon immediately, the activity of the study center, so you can understand how this is in line with the project and how this participates to this project. And I leave the floor to Fabio. Yes, what we're illustrating today is just a part, some excerpts, some extracts from the study center to trace the margins, the outline of this phenomenon that by nature is submerged. And based on some general information and a minimum of this analysis of the genesis of this phenomenon, we perform a profile of the victim, a profile of the offender, and then I would give the floor back to my boss for the legal references. First of all, in order to collect this information, we have involved the whole ECPAT network. It is a major network because it is based in more than 70 locations in the world, but we're still receiving information. At the end of this presentation, we'll make a proposal to further widen this information gathering, this information collection, to enrich this database for everyone. So as far as the increase of this sexual tourism with minors, we've analyzed the objective causes and objective increase of the private airline companies, and the decrease of this offer makes it possible to reach distant destinations that were unthinkable 20 years ago. There's this tolerance from certain governments in order to increase the flow into their countries. These markets are always developed wherever there's a major symmetry between the sex offender and the victim. These are stories of misery, of despair. There are strong interests on the part of the organized crime. Yes, I'll go slower. We heard the address presented by Lucia, who specified how this phenomenon could be among the first 3 in the world that have constantly been presented and discussed over the last 20 years. The 3 main sectors are the drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, and human trafficking. And these are always they alternate at the first, second, and 3 top positions. But the these are the items that cause the most amount of money into this organized crime. Subjective motivations. To present this, we have based ourselves, relied on the little data available on these people, because the subjective motivations are an exit from a habitual context, so no social contract, no social control, impunity, share the transgression. And then we'll look at the difference between occasional tourism and habitual customary tourism. But most of these people, in addition to lacking this perception of committing a crime, would never adopt, would never behave in this manner in their own country, because of a sort of a social contract, which could be the family, colleagues, acquaintances. So they count on this factor of impunity and on the fact that certain behaviors in a foreign country will never be conveyed, will never reach his country of origin. In addition, there is a discriminating attitude beyond racism, and for example, based on this sentence, quote unquote, they're not children as ours, and this in their own context and country, they'll have a higher threshold of respect and consideration toward the younger citizens and the children. Abroad, there's a sort of normalization. If we also look at the diffusion and tolerance of the legal authorities, the local legal authorities, so they get into this why not attitude. These are not people who intend to consume sex with minors whenever they go on vacation, but then, because of this scarce perception of this crime, gets them into this why not attitude. So this behavior of this habitual tourist, after experiencing it once, he then intends to repeat it, even performing several trips during the same year to the same destination, because they have this why not attitude, because this person finds himself in a specific situation where he decides he will live certain experiences, and based on his experience, he could also be disgusted or decide to never repeat such an experience. So it may become like an occasional episode, and this is not a reduction with respect to the seriousness and gravity of this crime. The crime remains a very serious one, but this is a limit between the habitual or occasional sex tourist. And then this becomes also a point of reference for other fellow nationals, a point of information, a reference point as far as the hotels that tolerate this, or this is like, it creates like a bridge to other fellow nationals who will then intend to live the same type of experience. Let's go back again to the topic that was presented at the beginning, traffic. The traffic is estimated around a figure of $100 billion. We must note that the amounts invested by all government at the global level are like 1/100th of that amount. So all the amounts that are invested to try to oppose and stop this phenomenon, and the profits produced for the organized crime, makes it even more difficult to carry out this fight. We have the flows here. I'll show you the flows from the business web. But here we go back to a specification which Stefano just presented earlier. A scarce traceability on the web by definition, so it is difficult to trace information. These are the latest traceable steps. For example, 12% in Asia, I could operate through an Asian server, but this doesn't mean that the person who's managing this trafficking activity is a person from Asia. Let's look at the at the supply chain of this child exploitation, we have a large base of abused minor. Then we have the organized crime and the corruption as to the police or public authority. This is another ground for this habitual sex tourist to reassure this person who wants to repeat this experience. This person is reassured as far as the tolerance in certain countries. Even if this person gets caught in the act with a small investment of small amounts like $200, this person will recover his passport and leave. This information is precious and valuable for sex offenders, and we have an infinite supply chain. Internet point, open spaces such as beaches, for example, until we get to the summit of this pyramid, the end user. This is a definition that we have just adopted, as we heard. On the contrary, if we rebuild this chain, not of child prostitution, but of child pornography, our pyramid is upside down, because we have the end users, who are potentially very numerous, and then going down we have the exchange process, exchange the catalogs online, MMS, so the web obviously increasing, but obviously the hard copy catalogs are decreasing. And then we have, as far as production of videos or images of child pornography, we may have either an organized crime organization or private individuals, because they have their customarily just film their own performances, but then they not only use them privately, but they also put them on this market, on a web market, where they exchange experiences or testimonies, film testimonies of what was done abroad. And then at the bottom we have the abused minor. We want to recall this this different configuration, because we will then look at the alibis, the excuses provided for their own behaviors among the people who were arrested because of these crimes. We also have a victim profile. Victim for the Convention on the Rights of the Child. According to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is anybody under 18 years of age. So we have a 10% of minors between the ages of 0 and 6. We go up to 30% from 7 to 12 years old. Obviously, the highest age range is between the 13 and 17 years old. The 0 to 6 year range, these are not children that are involved in prostitution as such, but they are used to produce films or child pornography images. Gender, here too, this is like public common knowledge. I mean, it's not only little girls, but also boys. In a proportion of 1 to 3, there's a 25% of males and 75% of females. As far as costs, ECPAT responded. The ECPAT that responded have presented a window quite wide, because we went from a minimum of $5 to a maximum of $100. But with $100, you can actually purchase the life or the innocence of a little boy or girl. So here we're talking about tourist flows. Here too we see some new developments in this latest slide. The touristic flows, as far as the departure, well, quite obvious. Germany, Holland, Great Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, and also Italy. From America, United States, Canada, Brazil, then China, Japan, and Taiwan in Asia. These are the main departure points. As far as destinations, we have the entire area of South Asia, but also in Latin America, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela. This information should not be ignored. There's a considerable internal demand, up to 50%, particularly an analysis in Kenya reveals that 38% of the minor customers are local, followed by Italians, Germans, French, etc. Through this information, we can also trace, more or less, in general terms, the profile of the offender. And here we enter into the meat of the question, pedophile. Only 5% of these cases. If by pedophile we mean the definition of a pedophile according to DSM-4, that is pedophilia intended as a behavioral disease, people who feel sexual impulse towards subjects, very young subjects, those who travel abroad, even from Italy, to have sexual relations with children of 11, 12 years, 13 years old, commit a very serious crime, but he's not defined as a pedophile. Pedophile is someone else. Here we have an article here that a band of pedophiles was found, an organization who used girls from the Eastern Europe. But this is not. It's not that it's not a crime, but the pedophilia is a most. Refers to a smaller circle, but more than double of the occasional tourists are the occasional ones who have this why not attitude. And then we also have some information here. We have some preconceived information that we have to clarify. We have to distance ourselves from the image, the stereotype of the sexual tourist that is a little older, rich, and industrial, who travels to the other side of the world to consume his wants and far from home. But this is only represented by 5% of these people, and the 45% are people with low to medium income, and 50% medium to high income. Especially as far as the age range, we have information that is opposed to the stereotype that we have created. The two main age ranges go between 18 to 30 years old, 24%, and 31 to 40 years old, 37%. Then it goes down for the age range up to 50 years old, and then less from 51 to 60 years old, and it increases a little bit beyond 60 years old. However, the larger percentages are concentrated in the age range that goes up to 40 years old. And this is connected to the information we saw before regarding the reduction of the fees, the costs, the multiplication of these direct flights with no stopovers to several parts of the world. And this is something that's accessible also to the 24-year-old student who just graduated from university, who can actually reach these far destinations as a gift to after he completes his study. But it is a fact that the age has decreased. The offender's age has decreased. Alibi. This is the curious aspect. The more frequent justification of this user, as far as images and alibi. Well, anyhow, this little girl is for sale. If I don't go, somebody else will. So, in between the lines, the destiny of this little girl is already marked. So, since I am the 10th or 15th customer, well, I didn't cause any damage to this little girl. This is one of the most widely used pretexts. The second one is the attempt to be seen as a benefactor, and this is quite diffused. This second alibi. Well, actually, I'm helping her and her family. To me, it's just a few dollars, but to them, this is a fortune. Remember what we said at the beginning. This is an element we all know very well, but it is in between the lines in this type of justification. Certain phenomena are stem from and developed develop where there's a huge gap between the availability, the availability of the sex offender and the victim. This is kind of a creating justifications for one's own conscience. When you feel a benefactor to help this little girl who's prostituting herself and her family with just a few dollars. I didn't force her, I didn't hurt her, I didn't give her drugs or alcohol or anything else. She was consensual. About the consent, we're all aware of the fact that there is no consent between a minor and an adult. We know it in these contexts. We are aware when we work in these issues. This consent is much thinner when we go to other environments. The justification of not having forced a victim, but somehow invoke the consent of the victim and also try to reverse the cause and effect relation. The following alibi: I'm not the victim, I am the victim, she's the one who picked me up. This happened. Sorry if I repeat myself, but we're talking about misery and despair. We spoke about open spaces, roads, beaches. We can also witness a sort of competition among these victims who fight for the potential offender. It is a matter of survival. Even in front of such behaviors, it could never been considered as a reduction of the gravity of what is being committed, of the crime that's being committed. I had no way of knowing that she was a minor. Well, here, we don't need to go to Cambodia, Mexico, Brazil. We hear this in our courts as well, maybe in Lombardy as well. And this, too, deals with invoking the ignorance of the age of the victim. But this does not constitute a reduction for those who commit these type of crimes. The other justification, it's a cultural issue. It's normal in their countries. And this is connected to the subjective motivations, to the fact that some children are considered different from our own. This the ostentation in certain markets changes this perception, the perception of this crime. Let's go on to the justification of the users of images or pornographic films. Yes, they admit that this is a perversion, but I am content with autoerotism in my life, self-erotism. In my life, I never touched a child. So, in their opinion, if there's no physical contact with a minor, and if they're content with just images, they feel less criminal than others. Let us recall the reversed pyramid we saw earlier. If there were no people who purchase and those who purchase these films or exchange, we would not need to produce them. Remember that at the top of this pyramid or the bottom of this pyramid, we always have an abused child. If there were no users of these products, we would not need to produce them. So we would not need to film or photograph these children in erotic positions to then put these products into the market. It's the law of supply and demand. So the ones who create the demand are guilty of this abuse of children, of this bottom of the pyramid. Even though you don't know where this child may be, or if you'll never see him or have contact with him, the crime does exist. New tendency, new trends. The new trends in this market, this is information that we are receiving from ECPAT. The first one is local material. To always the impunity of the sex offender traveling abroad. Traveling with a camera is the most normal thing that can happen, but those who desire, as we said, those who desire to film their own performances don't need a regular camera. They do it in enclosed places, so they need a whole set of different equipment. So we could stop those at the borders as they leave or come back, and come back with, they may leave with all the materials necessary and then return with a flash key or something that may not be suspicious at all. Another information we heard, and we heard several times, a progressive displacement of this phenomena towards the European Union. The last phenomenon is the one of the female offender. It differs. It is different from the male user base, as we can say. For so far, these are limited to European Union, United States. The female tourist is different because of the type of request. The age of the victim is connected to the sexual orientation. So, those with lesbian sexual orientation will search for very little victims, very young victims, because the type of sex that is performed is compatible with the younger ages. And we're always talking about minors, but the main difference, as I was saying, they will search for older partners or victims in case of an hetero orientation. But the difference is in a greater promiscuity in the in males. We're talking about other continents. We're not talking about a weekend stay. We're talking about a stay of a few weeks or a month. He will search for multiple partners. The she offender will tend to have a fixed partner for the entire period spent abroad, with no hypocrisy, knowing that this is a mercenary relation. We're not talking about falling in love or anything like that. She may return the following year to search for another partner, but she will keep the same partner during the entire stay. However, this is a phenomenon that is unknown to the other when the roles are inverted. When he is the one searching for company, he will go to different bar or facility every night looking for a different partner. But the female offender does exactly the contrary. Another piece of information: the female involvement also in trafficking, in human trafficking. It is an involvement that is increasing and connected to a very interesting notion that Gabriele mentioned yesterday when he showed us that image about the escalator. Yes, a child accompanied. Yes, but accompanied by whom? Is there a family relationship between the child and the one who's accompanying him? Okay, these moves are always studied to guarantee the impunity of those committing these crimes. So the female involvement in human trafficking crimes, here we have two more examples, cannot be compared because this has to do with Liberia. This is in Nigeria. We cannot compare them because one has a basis of 60, the other one 20. But in both, you see the female involvement is prevailing with respect to the male involvement. Because simply a woman with 3 children at the border raises less questions than a man with 3 children crossing a border. This is simply the reason. So there are less possibilities to be controlled, to be checked, and to run into obstacles, and less possibilities to interrupt this flow. And we get to the conclusions. Prior to the conclusions, before concluding, I wanted to make a proposal. We said it at the beginning. This is just one part of the material. It'd be too long and boring to list all the work that was done by this documentation center. It involves many more profiles that are more strictly legal from a criminology standpoint. But when we speak of a global analysis, the discourse becomes more complex because there's so many more behaviors that represent the crime in Italy, which may not be in other countries. Other behaviors that represent the crime in Tunisia, maybe, but not in Italy, maybe in Mexico, or not in Italy, or in Cambodia, and not in Mexico. Anyhow, configuring these behaviors is not strictly related to an article of the code. It's not possible. But to do this, we have relied on a major network. But this is not the only source, and it cannot be the only source to collect information. The proposal is to extend to other NGOs or centers. I was thinking about the friends from CELP or other sources who could contribute, who could provide information, in some cases information to be assessed or estimates to integrate to this database to trace the outline of this phenomenon. But of course, this relationship of collaboration cannot be one-sided. We receive information, but ultimately, the process that results from this data has to be shared to either identify the phenomenon or to classify our own country within this phenomenon, or to present the projects in a documented fashion, to have some shared and common material, a shared and common database. This is a proposal that we can certainly study further.
Okay, we have seen the profile very quickly. We deemed it appropriate to mention the regulations of reference. As we have seen this morning already, this is being studied within the EBNT observatory. The regulations that we referred to that are promoted by ECPAT in Italy, and behind it there's a whole series of suggestions coming from international agreements, worldwide conferences promoted and organized by ECPAT itself, in collaboration with UNICEF and the host governments. The first regulation of reference is Law 269 of 1998 that gives rise to the study that we have seen earlier of EBNT Observatory. What happened with this law? There was the introduction, besides the acknowledgement of the whole of all the forms of child exploitation, so child prostitution, the use of minors for child pornography, trafficking for sexual tourism and sexual tourism against minors. There is the extraterritoriality principle, the possibility to punish these crimes when they are perpetrated abroad, and then decide whether they can be prosecuted in the country of destination or in Italy. With the law of Law 269 of 1998, there is a first obligation by all travel agents to insert a clause saying that all the travel agents commit themselves not to organize travels for sexual tourism with penalties and convictions. With law number 38 of 2006, partially modifying law number 269, so there's the permanent obligation for all tour operators and travel agents, and the law does not specify the fact that organizers might have to produce hard copies of material that circulates online. This is a defect of a law, because then we will talk about it when we talk about law number 1672. Well, often the law had to specify this also through the internet. The fact that it's not written that the internet should be also included, this is the element that makes the difference between the fact that those who still organize travels and advertise them with paper catalogs has this clause, and those who organize online travels feel exonerated by this obligation. The need to specify this telematic means is redundant, but we will commit ourselves to, well, given the results of the observatory and given those who might be data corresponding to the data of our study center, we will endeavor to have this legislation change in this sense. So law number 38 imposes a permanent obligation to all travel organizers and specifies all the penalties for child pornography production. It defines virtual child pornography, and it exacerbates penalties. Law 172, which is very recent, it was passed in 2012. It also sanctions the ratification of the Lanzarote Convention. With this law, there was a sort of step backwards with reference to the Italian legislation, because we should admit, and it was repeated yesterday as well, Italy had nothing to say anymore on this, because Law 269 of 1998, with the integrations of 2006, was rather complete. With Law number 172, there was a little bit of confusion because there was an exacerbation of penalties, but unlike what we expected, namely an exacerbation of the minimal penalties and not the maximum, the opposite happened. So there was an exacerbation of the maximum penalties envisaged. And then another problem that occurred was that the term pedophilia was erroneously used. With Law 172, there is the introduction of the crime of solicitation of pedophile practices, also through, well, and then there's the excuse of producing artistic or literary material is no longer accepted. And so there's a cultural problem. We need to clarify what we mean by pedophilia in general. Another element that law number 172 introduced was the solicitation crime. In the previous legislation, it was defined as grooming. There's a problem here because the law does not enable to configure a crime, but it acts on the intention. So anyone who has a dialogue with a child, also in a chat line, even though they do not intend to exchange child pornography or have a sexual relation with the child, is introduced in the judiciary system. We find some specific internet types of crimes and criminals. It's all self-explanatory. It's people who, one way or the other, evolve in terms of how they commit the crime. So first, they are people who act in an isolated way. Then they find other people to join and with which to exchange material, or possibly produce and disseminate and circulate this material. These are the modalities for the dissemination and production of images, so self-production and autonomous possession. And there's a more complex, the fact of using for commercial purposes. It's difficult to distinguish whether you want to get into the market or whether you want to remain isolated. This is just to clarify the differences with reference to those who normally commit this type of crimes and then organized crime that put in place a whole system they profit on. This is a internet classification, the latest classification, because here too, those who actually exchange and collect child pornography might, in the end, get into direct contact. This is rare, though, because at the world level, more or less all, with a few exceptions, according to the minimum age to have the first in sexual relations, we have to come to terms to this. So the minor is from 0 to 18 years of age, but there is an age of consent to be taken into consideration. Anyway, there is the holder of child pornography that distributes it and exchanges it, and there are those who want to directly meet their victims, and this might correspond to what we define the grooming crime. Grooming is a term that is used in the Lanzarote Convention. It's borrowed from the study of animal behavior, and it doesn't really reflect what we define as a groomer. It's a person who technically, psychologically manipulates the minor until they obtain their consent. And they almost make it look like it's the minor who asks to meet the groomer and abuser. We would like to conclude here because this is the information that we obtained so far at the global level, and to have an overall picture of the phenomenon, I would like to repeat that emerged from the data we have seen earlier. It's not possible to carry out individual studies on the type of sexual tourism or those who produce child pornography, who are the sex offenders that act on the internet or outside it, trafficking of minors to exploit them sexually, because the phenomenon should be taken into consideration in all its aspects. Then other data might possibly be extracted on the age of the victim, but it's not possible to divide these phenomena. We are continuing to fight from a legal viewpoint, because the crimes are punished with different sentences. By the end of the summer or the beginning of the fall, we will have these data. This is our commitment in Safe Host program. It will be an overall picture of the phenomenon, and it's going to be circumscribed, limited to the European territory, because that's the scope of the project, and it responds to the pathway undertaken by the Council of Europe with their directives. And I would like to, I know that I'm the last speaker, so I'm going to take some more space. Once the project has ended, and we all know that those who normally participate in EU projects have this ex-post assessment tasks. This assessment has to be given to the relevant people in the EU. At the end of the project, it would be appropriate to have an internal assessment of all the partners and come up with the proposals both at the national and at the European level, because if it's true that there is a great confusion that we ourselves as organizations create, I'm the first one to say it, as we are not well connected amongst ourselves, we are working a lot on this, and this the reason why such confusion is created. We have noticed that the EU itself is creating confusion with a whole series of directives and funding channels for projects that they propose to be able to defeat this, to eradicate this phenomenon. On the 23rd of April last, there was a resolution where sexual tourism was mentioned again, and there was a new Euro MP talked about our data and asked once again for prevention actions to be undertaken. So things have been said and repeated. We should try to find this modality because it's part of social dialogue to try and have a dialogue with the institution and be able to be the spokespeople of spokespersons of something more tangible within the EU, because so far it would seem that sometimes there are these appeals launched through the project, but then at the end we see the results and we are the only ones who see the results and not the EU. Thank you.